Gary always wanted his own cafe, not a chain, not a franchise, just a small corner shop with good coffee and his name above the door. He'd been saving for years, working other people's coffee machines, learning the trade, waiting for the right corner to open up. Then he found it, a tidy little shop front on a busy corner, morning sun hitting the window just right, steady foot traffic from the office block across the road. He called it the daily grind. Opening week was everything he'd imagined, regulars within days. A queue out the door on Saturday mornings. Gary felt like he'd finally made it. The day he signed the lease, he barely looked past the headline number. 5 years. Reasonable rent. He skimmed the rest and signed where the agent pointed. Buried in the fine print was a single line about how rent would be reviewed each year. He didn't think twice about it. Nobody reads page 14 when they're excited about page 1. Year 1 was good. Regulars kept showing up. Rent stayed exactly where it started, and Gary barely thought about the lease again. Then the first review date arrived. A letter from the landlord's agent, rent going up, tied to something called CPI. Gary didn't know what CPI actually meant for his lease. He assumed it was small, a few percent, nothing that would break him. CPI is just inflation measured every quarter and published by the government. When a lease is tied to it, your rent doesn't rise because your cafe is doing better. It rises because bread, electricity, and everything else got more expensive that year, whether your till agrees or not. That part felt fair enough on its own. What Gary didn't realize was the part that came next. Each year's increase doesn't apply to the rent he started with. It compounds on top of last year's already higher number. Small increases early on, bigger increases stacked on top of bigger increases later, quietly snowballing in the background while he focused on lattes and rosters. Year 2, a small bump manageable. Year 3, another still manageable. His rent had started at $55,000 a year. By year 3, it was closer to $60,000. Then came the years everyone remembers. Inflation ran hot across the whole economy. Prices for everything climbed fast, and Gary's rent review letter climbed right along with it. 1 year alone, his rent jumped by more than it had in the first 3 years combined. By year 4, it was pushing past $80,000. He hadn't added a single table. His coffee beans, his milk, his cups, his staff wages, all going up at the same time as his rent. Multiple leaks all at once, all hitting the same thin margin. Here's the part that actually broke him. A CPI review doesn't just add a flat number each year, it multiplies. Take a rent of $60,000 and apply a 4% CPI movement, and next year's rent isn't $62,400 just once. The year after, that same percentage applies to the new higher number, compounding quietly year after year on top of a base that keeps climbing. Some months, Gary stopped paying himself just to cover wages and rent. He picked up extra shifts behind the machine himself instead of hiring the second barista he badly needed. Gary raised his prices to cover it, just a little at first. Regulars noticed, a few started making their coffee at home instead. He asked his landlord if there was any flexibility, any cap, any ceiling on how far this could climb before it broke him. There wasn't. Nobody had negotiated one at the start, just CPI uncapped, compounding every single year, exactly as written on page 14. Across the street, his friend Steve ran a small gift shop. Same block, same landlord group, completely different outcome. Steve's lease was classified differently, and his rent review had a hard ceiling built in from day one. Gary used to think Steve was just lucky. Later, he learned luck had very little to do with it. Then, quietly, things around the block started to slow. Foot traffic on the street dropped. A couple of nearby shops closed their doors for good. Gary thought, at least maybe this means my rent eases off a little next year. It didn't. He found the second clause, the one that mattered even more than the first, a ratchet clause. Rent could never fall, no matter what happened to the market, no matter what CPI did, only flat or up, never down. Gary assumed there were rules protecting small shop owners from exactly this. There are, but only for certain kinds of leases. His wasn't classified the way he'd assumed. He'd signed what's called a commercial lease, not a retail lease. Commercial leases in Australia don't get the same protections retail tenants get. No cap, no ban on ratchet clauses, just whatever the document says, and he'd agreed to all of it years earlier without understanding a word of it. By year 4, the math stopped working. Rent had climbed far past what the cafe could comfortably carry. Margins were thin, some weeks barely there at all. Gary started quietly thinking about which day he'd have to lock the door for the last time. One evening after close, he almost told his one barista, Mia, that this might be their last month. He got as far as "I need to tell you something," then couldn't finish the sentence. He went home instead and just sat with it. Late one night, closer to giving up than he'd admit to anyone, he opened an AI chat and pasted in his entire lease. Every clause, every page he'd skimmed years earlier without reading properly. He asked it one simple question: explain this lease to me like I'm signing it for the first time. And for the first time, Gary actually understood what he'd agreed to. He learned there were 3 different ways rent gets reviewed: fixed increases, market reviews, CPI reviews like his. Each one plays out completely differently depending on what the economy does next. He learned that caps and collars exist for exactly this reason: to stop a CPI review from running wild in a high inflation year. He'd simply never known to ask for one. He learned to check which CPI series a lease actually names, because the wrong one or a vague one can quietly cost thousands over a 5-year term without anyone noticing until it's too late. He learned the difference between retail and commercial leases and why that one classification buried in a definitions clause had quietly decided which protections applied to him and which didn't. It was almost too late, but almost isn't the same as too late. Gary went back to his landlord not to complain, but with an actual plan this time. He didn't lead with how unfair it felt, he led with numbers. "I want to renew for 3 years, not 5. And this time, I need a CPI review with a hard cap written into the lease, not left to chance." The landlord pushed back at first, said the current terms were standard for the block. Gary held his ground. "An empty shopfront doesn't pay you anything either. A cap tenant who stays 5 more years is worth more to you than a maximum figure you might never actually collect." The landlord agreed, not because he suddenly became generous, but because Gary had finally learned how to make that argument properly with numbers instead of frustration. The daily grind stayed open, barely, by weeks, not months. Gary kept the machine running, the regulars coming back one by one, the queue slowly reforming on Saturday mornings. He never did finish that sentence to Mia. He didn't need to. He still thinks about how close it came, how one clause sitting quietly on page 14 nearly cost him everything he'd spent years building, one quarterly letter at a time. Now, before he signs anything, he reads every single clause out loud to himself first. Every rent review, every cap, every ratchet, every classification. He asks what happens in a good year, and just as importantly, what happens in a bad one. Because the fine print isn't just paperwork sitting between him and the part he actually cares about, it's the machine that quietly decides whether a small business survives the next 5 years or doesn't. And most people, like Gary once did, don't find that out until the letter arrives.